Dan, I got to say, great to have you in the studio and great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor for me.
And what a timely article you have written, because you look at what's going on in Europe right now, the economic crisis, and you wrote an article about how Europeans need to look at what's going on with their ability not to own a firearm, no ability for self-defense. And this was all sparked by a conference you recently were at.
I was at a conference in Europe that was a lot of really rich people and people who manage money for really rich people. And what shocked me was sort of during the socializing time, the meals, the breaks, and things like that, how many of these rich people were talking about their escape plans. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, we think things are going to fall apart. And of course, we've already seen riots in London, we've seen riots in Greece, and you look at these projections for the welfare state and you see the European fiscal crisis now, and it's kind of understandable that they think everything is going to heck in a handbasket, and they're actually planning to leave because they don't think it's safe for them and their families. And that got me thinking about, okay, if you're really rich and you can have a pre-fueled private jet sitting someplace, okay, you have your way out. But what if you're just a regular person? And based on my travels in Europe, I started thinking, well, the Swiss are probably in good shape. I've been in lots of Swiss homes, and people show me their guns. But if you're in the UK or a place like that where there's really no individual rights for firearms ownership, I mean, imagine if society breaks down and the welfare state collapses into some sort of Mad Max dystopia, which we all hope, of course, never happens. But if it does, where would I rather be, Switzerland or England?
And that's a good point, because when I read your article, as you mentioned, the first thing I thought of was the riots. And I was over in the aftermath, and you talked to so many of these people, and they said, it was our own fault. We didn't fight for our rights. We don't have an NRA. But you look at what happened. They were left defenseless. The police were told to stand down by the government. And who had the guns? The thugs and the criminals that were breaking through the windows of the stores.
Yeah, I actually, in addition to that blog post we were just talking about, I wrote something, I don't know, must have been right around the time of the riots. And I compared how the Korean shop owners in Los Angeles, back in 1992 was it, were able to defend themselves.
And they stood on the roofs.
But the Kurdish and the Turkish immigrant communities that have the small businesses that were getting ransacked, they had no ability. They had to go out there basically with just their fist against the thugs that were better armed. And I thought, this is just, it's not just bad justice policy, it's so fundamentally immoral that government doesn't fulfill one of its few legitimate functions of law and order, and yet it disarms the innocent law-abiding people that need to protect themselves and their families and their livelihoods.
And you made a great point in your article, because you said this is the first line and it's the last line of defense.
Yeah, well, of course, you know this stuff 10 times better than I know it. But what's the old line people sometimes use? When crisis is seconds away, the police are just minutes away.
Just call 911. That's what they tell you here. Why do you need a firearm? Just call 911.
Well, I have 3 children, including a daughter, and I darn sure don't ever want to have to rely on the police, even though the police, I think, are good government workers. 95% of them, I'm sure, are on our side and want to help and things like that. But you see some of these big city police chiefs that are just parroting this politically correct line about gun bans and things like that. And you think maybe we'll wind up like Europe in 20 years, and that's a frightening prospect.
I've got to ask you, because you travel to Europe quite a bit, do you ever hear any talk? Because I know, amongst many of the people that I visited with after the riots, they talk that they are trying to make some changes, that there are some members of parliament that are trying to make some changes, especially in the aftermath of what you saw what happened to people like Tony Martin, who used a firearm because he called the police over 10 times to come out to his property. They never showed up. So when some thugs broke into his house, he did what he had to do, and guess who ends up in prison? He does. And there is sort of a background effort going on. But do you ever hear from people when you're over there about what they see, any possibility for change?
Well, my experiences wouldn't be scientific in any way, because I'm going over to talk at fiscal policy conferences, because I'm a fiscal policy wonk and I talk about taxes and spending. But I'm usually meeting with the conservative and free market think tanks and stuff like that. And oftentimes, just because I am a strong believer in the Constitution and the Second Amendment, I ask what the situation is over there. 2 things I'll tell you. One, Austria is actually not that bad. They're not where we want them to be, or for that matter, where we want the U.S. to be. But there is fairly open and free gun possession laws over there. But the other thing that's interesting, you'll find amusing, I was giving a speech in Brussels at the European Parliament, and I had on, just by coincidence, an NRA tie.
Brave guy.
One of my kids had given it to me for Christmas, so you can see I raised my kids right. A member of the European Parliament, MEPs they're called, from England, or I guess the United Kingdom to be technical, saw the tie, loved it, and said, I realize this is a little bit cheeky. I think he used, of course, that British phrase, but I would love to have that tie. And, of course, being a good American and wanting to spread the word, I gladly turned over the tie because I realized that we don't have many beachheads over there, people who believe in this fundamental individual freedom, and I was glad to do my small part.
Yeah, and there are, like I said, a lot of people over there trying to make some changes. But as one, and so many of them tell me, I should say, don't do what we did. Don't make the mistake we made, because once your rights are gone, they're gone. And I think that's a clear message. They always say, I say, what's your message? They say, don't take your rights for granted.
You know, it's funny. It's not just in the UK and Europe and certain other countries where you have to worry about things falling apart. You look at our long-run forecasts in terms of the aging population and the entitlements. We're basically heading to become Greece, and if we continue to have politicians in Washington who don't do the right thing or even try to make things worse, we could wind up in some sort of dystopian future where society begins to break down. And it's kind of funny, with the speeches I give around the country in the U.S., I used to always, at the end of my speeches, when I sort of lay out all these long-run forecasts and say, we desperately need to reform or our society is going to be at risk, I used to always have this line that I used as a joke. I'd say, so my one recommendation to you is stock up on bottled water, canned goods, and ammo. It's amazing how many people afterwards will come up and say, Dan, I'm already doing that. So you already have Americans who are afraid about the future of our country. The Europeans, of course, are way past that because they see the beginnings of the breakdown now. And if you don't have faith that the politicians are going to fix these problems, then you as an individual, as someone who cares about your family, your local community, if you don't have the right to protect yourself, that's just, it's criminal in the moral sense.
Yeah, and you look at what's going on with this administration right now. And I think people are, even if they don't own a firearm or have never, they're more concerned about where their rights are headed. I think a lot of people are concerned about it. And I thought it was interesting in your article because you say now you've got a new argument. You're going to add a new item to your list, and it is that personal protection against social breakdown.
And
I don't think a lot of people have looked at it that way, but I think we need to.
Well, that's fundamentally what these rich people in Europe at that conference I mentioned were talking about. They wanted to escape, and they had the means, the resources, and the wealth to escape. But as we just talked about, what about the ordinary people? What about the average, honest, hardworking, middle-class people? They don't have the private jets. They don't have the account in a bank in Geneva or something like that. But they do want to protect themselves, and they should have a right to protect themselves. And their politicians are failing them by taking away their rights, and their politicians are failing them by creating the conditions that are going to lead to an economic collapse unless they change it, which, of course, so far we're not seeing much evidence they will.
And when you look at the thing you're talking about, that these people had planes, they had places to go, sounds familiar. You look at the folks that are pushing the anti-gun movement here. You got the Bloombergs of the world. They've got the money to go and do whatever they need to do. They've got the self-protection. They've got the security guards. And they're the ones saying, hey, you don't need a gun. And when push comes to shove, you're the only one that's going to be there to protect your family.
Well, that's sort of just the funny thing about limousine liberals, as they're called in general. They have personal bodyguards who have guns. And they have the ability to escape. Mayor Bloomberg in New York, he has his own little getaway down in the Bahamas. So if everything goes to, the wrong direction in the U.S., and again, knock on wood that this will never happen, but you can't dismiss it because we're seeing it happening in Europe.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thanks for stopping by.
Well,
and always good to talk to you. And we'll be watching for more stories from you.
Great. Thank you.